will be presented by Tina Soreide, Director General of the Norwegian Competition Agency. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Welcome to this session on digital mergers. My name is Tina Soreide. I'm leading the Norwegian Competition Authority. As Commissioner Didier Reynolds underscored in the speech, mergers in digital markets raise some distinct concerns compared to traditional markets, and especially when we involve platform companies. As enforcement agency, we see market concentration evolving in new ways with a risk of winner-takes-all sorts of dynamics. Firms obtain huge, sudden, and unpredicted benefits because of their access to data. The way they use data can create digital barriers to entry, and this has forced us to rethink how we define markets. Digital market dominance might leverage into adjacent markets, and such consequences are difficult to predict. Digitalization creates new risks of coordination, and this matters as well also in merger decisions. And we face new sorts of consumer harm, even in markets where the price appears to be zero. In terms of solutions, there are important reforms at the regional level, including the DMA in the European Union. But the reasons for concern are not limited by geography. Regional reforms may not be enough, for example, if the problem is global, if the market in question is too local, or if implementation of regional reform is slowed down at the national level. We are many, small and large agencies alike, who feel a sort of urgency in making sure that we have in place proper oversight and enforcement. This is why the ICN Merger Working Group established the Digital Mergers Project. Since our last ICN conference, the project has facilitated important experience sharing among agencies of all sizes from all parts of the world, and it also included some non-governmental representatives. A series of webinars were organized by the Norwegian Competition Authority and DG Comp, with results presented in a summary report on digital mergers. The topics addressed by the Digital Mergers Project included regulatory shortcomings, market definition, conglomerate theories of harm, and remedies. And these are themes that will be addressed in this session as well. With me in this panel, I have Sarah Cardell, the Chief Executive of the Competition and Market Authority in the United Kingdom. I have Alexandre Cordeiro, the President of the Administrative Council for Economic Defense in Brazil, CAGI. I have Olivier Garçon, the Director General for Competition in the European Union, and Michael Reynolds, who is here as non-governmental. He is of counsel to Allen & Overy's International Antitrust Group and represents also the International Bar Association, of which he was previously the president. And Michael, I will pass the first floor to you because the first question we have today is, are digital mergers slipping through the cracks of regulatory review? Will you say something about this question and start the discussion?
Yes, indeed. It's a great pleasure on behalf of the IBA to be here. The IBA has always been very closely involved in the work of the ICN, which we discuss at our conferences around the world, and Cani Fernandez was a distinguished former co-chair of our antitrust section. I'd like to thank her also for the magnificent arrangements here in Barcelona. In the 1990s and the years 2000s, there was an explosion of merger control rules around the world. And the ICN, through its work from its initial conference in the Castello d'Uovo in Naples in 2002, added much needed clarity and convergence, greatly welcomed by the business community and their advisors. The question now is, in the fast-moving digital world and in the face of a perceived enforcement gap, is whether those achievements are put at risk as agencies adopt divergent approaches to deal with digital mergers. Just down the road from here, there is a very impressive statue of Cristobal Colón, Christopher Columbus. When Christopher Columbus set sail from the port of Palos in August 1492 across the Atlantic, he had hardly any navigational equipment. He had the moon and the stars, a quadrant, a compass, an astrolabe. The reality was, for most of that trip, he and his crew had no idea where they were or where they were going, and when they hit land, they thought they were in Asia. In fact, they were in the Bahamas. It was a voyage into the unknown, and I really don't think that the international business community and its advisors should be embarked onto a voyage into the unknown in planning digital mergers. And I think we would greatly welcome recommended practices from the ICN dealing with this new world, and the recent draft report of the working group on mergers, I think, is a very, very good contribution to that. Well, in Catalonia they have proverbs, and the ICN's work has always been governed by the proverbs of the country where it finds itself. In Catalan they say, os peixos grans manjaram os peixos petits. That means the big fishes eat the little fishes. And the enforcement gap, I think, has arisen because, for example, startups which are focused on building a customer and a user base and not on generating short-term profits, those acquisitions, when they're taken over by a large platform, escape the present thresholds, and the big fish with the little fish inside it gets through the net. Agencies in dealing with this problem have adopted different approaches. Some rely on their existing traditional turnover thresholds. Here in Spain, for example, they're able to use a market share threshold, which has been criticized in the past, but does enable them to catch a lot of these mergers. Other countries, Germany, Austria, Turkey, and now perhaps Australia, are adopting transaction value thresholds. 400 million euros in Germany, 200 million euros in Austria, 10 million euros in Turkey. The amounts differ, but at least we know what the thresholds are. The European Commission, however, did not decide to go down that road of a transactional value threshold, but decided to employ what many of us thought had become an obsolete provision of the merger control regulation, Article 22, which is known as the Dutch clause, which enables member states to refer to the Commission in Brussels mergers which are not caught by the merger thresholds of the merger regulation at the European level if they affect trade between member states and significantly affect competition. And using that provision, the Commission has been able to get its hands on mergers referred by member states. And in fact, it actually invites and solicits member states to make referrals to it. Referrals which are made even though the transactions are not caught by the thresholds of the national merger control rules. When Article 21 was introduced, most member states in the European Union did not have merger control. That's why it was put there. It wasn't put there really to deal with this situation, where we now have most of the countries in the European Union have merger control rules, and transactions which are not caught by those are now referred in a process which is not totally transparent to Brussels. This has aroused a lot of controversy. People say it's a departure from the bright line test, that it departs from the ICN's recommended practice that there should be a material nexus with the reviewing jurisdiction, and also its legal basis is under attack in the European courts. In the Illumina case, we're still waiting for it now for the judgment of the European Court of Justice with a final say on whether this is well-founded legally. So I think whatever happens in the Illumina case, it would be great to have from the Commission and the European Competition Network some guidance on how this system, if that's what we are going to have to rely on, is going to work. So I have a question for Olivier. Olivier, how do you view the enforcement gap? And what are your views on the criticisms that Article 22 has created unnecessary uncertainty and helped to create a voyage into the unknown?
Well, thank you. I think there is no doubt that a number of cases have been slipping through the cracks because, at least in the EU, but in many jurisdictions, the net to capture significant mergers was dimensioned in turnover threshold terms. And what we see for a number of years, for a great deal of reasons, because innovation becomes more and more important, is that it is more often that the acquisition of very small targets may have a huge impact on competition, sometimes on a global scale. If you push it to the limit, a zero turnover target can have potentially a very big detrimental impact on the working of competition globally. So it is unthinkable that these deals are not reviewed. That's the starting point. And there is no review of the turnover thresholds that can cope for this. So the starting point of our reflection was this. There are an increasing number of cases of this type, and we need to find a way to review it while keeping the economy of the system and not overburdening the industry. This is why we rediscovered Article 22. That's the good thing with being old, you remember. So we rediscovered Article 22, and what we did is something really simple. We changed our recommendation to the member states. So it is not that the Commission has changed its interpretation of Article 22. If you look throughout the various review of the merger regulation we have conducted ever since 1994, consistently the Commission has said Article 22 allows member states to refer cases for which they do not have competence, except that we were immediately adding, but please, member states, do not do it. And actually, in 2004, we even considered changing Article 22 in order to make it impossible. And in the end of the day, the Council decided not to do it. And the reason was clear, is that because innovation was a far less prominent factor in competition, the number of cases for which a very low turnover target could potentially affect very negatively competition on a large scale were extremely, extremely scarce. So we thought the balance of advantages and disadvantages was calling for discouraging member states from doing it. The landscape has changed, and we think not the balance, therefore, has changed. That's why we have decided to change that recommendation. And this, of course, was upheld by the General Court, and we are now, as you said, Michael, waiting the higher court judgment. So, in the end of the day, you said it, around the world, we have various ways to deal with this situation, but you need to deal with this situation. And the counterfactual in Europe was dreadful. I mean, what should have we done? Go down to zero turnover threshold for the target and subject the entire world to an obligation of notification? That's not reasonable. So we believe that the burden that is put on companies is moderate for something that has a clear public interest. The second part of your question, there never was a bright line for the reason I just explained, because it was always possible. I would argue that as it was possible for member states, and it is their God-given right to refer a merger below their national competence threshold, when we had a recommendation not to do it, they could have disobeyed that recommendation, and that would have created a real uncertainty. Now, I would say there is certainty in the uncertainty. You know, as a lawyer advising firms, that if your merger is potentially problematic, you'd better come and talk, because it is not unlikely you will end up being dealt with in the EU. I think it's good. Last point I would like to make is that it's not a mass destruction weapon. It's really something that allows to handpick the very few cases that are really problematic and really small. We're talking about 3 cases in 3 years. I cannot promise there will not be 2 next year, or 0, but we see it as remaining something for limited use in cases that are really worth it. But talking of different ways of addressing the issue, maybe Sarah, because you have another way of addressing it in the UK, which is the share of supply test, and maybe you could tell us whether you think it resulted into fewer mergers slipping through the cracks in the UK.
Thanks very much, Olivier, and thank you also again for the opportunity to speak here today. Is the microphone working okay? That's okay. I think it's great. Yeah. So, look, I think firstly I would echo very much exactly what you said, Olivier, in terms of the objectives of seeking to tackle these mergers, and it also echoes, I think, many of the themes that Lena mentioned earlier. So in the UK, we've had the benefit of 2 different jurisdictional threshold tests. One is a turnover test, which is very similar to many other jurisdictions, and then the second, as Olivier mentioned, is the share of supply test. Now that's actually been a long-standing feature of UK merger control, so it's not something that's been brought in response to mergers in digital markets, but it is something that is I think quite useful for us to utilize, because the share of supply test isn't a sort of strict market share test. It doesn't require us to define an economic market in the way that we do for substantive assessments. And it means that we can look at the share of supply in quite a fluid way in order to make sure that we are taking jurisdiction over deals, particularly where one of the merging parties may not have sales, for example, so we don't have to define a share of supply by reference to sales. It can be by reference to a number of different measures. So, for example, in our review of the Meta Giphy acquisition a couple of years ago, we looked at share of supply by reference to the ability of users to search for GIFs through websites and apps, and that was the way that we took jurisdiction over that merger. And it's really important, I think, in this debate to emphasize that this is about jurisdiction. You know, we still, whichever jurisdictional rules and thresholds we use, we still have to go through the substantive assessment, and we'll obviously come on to discuss that. But this is very much a gating mechanism, and I think it's incredibly important that as agencies we have the ability to take a very careful look at these deals, which can give rise to very significant competition concerns. So we've used that quite a bit in the UK. I don't think we think it's bulletproof, so to your question, I don't think it's a guarantee that deals won't slip through the net. And maybe just a few quick comments on what's changing there and where I think a gap still remains. So we have, going through our UK Parliament at the moment, some legislation which will bring in a whole new regime in relation to digital markets regulation, which is sort of distinct from merger control, and I won't talk about that now. But it also brings in a couple of provisions that are relevant to merger control. One is a general one, so it's not digital market specific, and it's really aimed at mergers where you don't have an increment. So even with our existing share of supply test, you have to have some kind of increment. But where you're looking at sort of pure vertical or conglomerate mergers, it may be that that share of supply test still doesn't capture those deals. So what's proposed now is really, to Lena and Olivier's points, where you're looking at deals with a very significant player who may be buying up a much smaller potential competitor, for example, or a competitor or a player in an adjacent or a vertical market. So the proposal is that we would have the ability to review those deals where one of the parties has a share of supply of 33%, so a very significant share of supply already, and where they have a UK turnover of £350 million. So a significant player in the UK, but there is no need for an incremental addition to that share of supply in those circumstances, although there will need to be some kind of nexus, some kind of connection to the UK. That's still to be worked through exactly how that will be established. So I think that will be an important additional lever for us. And then the other proposal that's going through the UK Parliament through the bill at the moment is a reporting requirement. So the new digital markets regime will enable us to designate major digital platforms having significant substantial market status, and where they are designated with SMS, then they will also have a reporting requirement to report any merger to us that they are carrying out, which has a value of £25 million. And that is important because, as some of you will know, we have a sort of non-mandatory notification regime in the UK, so deals can complete without notifying to us. And where we see these deals happening involving these major digital players, we think it's really important that we are alerted to those deals, and we then decide whether we actually have jurisdiction and want to prioritise reviewing those deals substantively. The final quick point I would make is that whilst all these measures are very helpful, and we've seen how different agencies are evolving, of course these markets and market dynamics are evolving rapidly too. So one of the pieces of work that the CMA has done is a piece of work around foundation models, generative AI, and we see a lot of partnerships and investments developing in that space at the moment, involving a number of the major players. And these are investments and partnerships that maybe oftentimes will sit below traditional merger control thresholds, and this is something that's very much on our radar to be watching and thinking about how we can make sure those partnerships, which may have many, many beneficial impacts, but could also be problematic from a competition perspective. I'm going to hand over next to Alexandra, because I know that you're also thinking in Brazil about your existing jurisdictional thresholds, whether they are sufficient or whether there is more that needs to be done to give you the jurisdiction to take a full look at these kind of deals.
Yes. So good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah. So in Brazil, our threshold is it's related to the income, the gross income. And there is always this discussion in Brazil as well, and the antitrust community keeps, trying to figure out if it's the correct threshold or not, if you should consider also the value of the deal or market share or something like that. But in Brazil, it's just the income. And it's already a low threshold, for example, and the companies are obligated to notify CAIDE if they have the income of around 150 million US dollars for one side, and the other side 15 million US dollars. And we do have around 700 mergers per year, and 95% of these mergers are fast track. So it doesn't have any like a lower concern in competition issue. But the problem is, what about those companies that doesn't reach this threshold, so it's not obligated to notify CADE and probably can have any competition issue or concern? There is a specific part in the CADE's law that even for those deals that doesn't reach the threshold, we can evoke the deal and analyze. So in 1 year after the deal are consumed, CADE can ask for the companies to notify those deals. It doesn't happen much. It's very rare to see CADE doing something like that. And usually CADE, what we do is trying to investigate the market, and also the company help us when the market help us when it doesn't reach the threshold. The companies and the market go to CADE and say, hey, I'm seeing a deal over there that could have a problem. And we have some deals that there is no income, but the market share is high, so this can cause some concern, and CADE could call the companies to notify. But I have a question for Tina. So, and compared to the other agencies representing this panel, Norwegian agencies are smaller in size. To what extent do you think size hinders you from efficiently dealing with digital mergers?
Thank you. Yes, Norway is a smaller country, and we are an authority of around 100 people. Regarding digital mergers, a main concern for us right now is that we really want to see the DMA being implemented, as we are EU included, but not full EU members. But as a small agency, we make use of the options we have, and in below threshold sort of cases, where big firms can easily go under the radar when they try to buy smaller companies. We have a call-in option, so we can actually impose on companies to notify us, and so that we can assess whether we want to permit the merger. And this option, of course, is very useful with respect to, for example, killer acquisitions. And also, right now, we are in the process of trying to upgrade us for more sophisticated data analysis. So we make some in-house changes to become better able to investigate the dynamic feature of markets. And we want to be able to analyze large amounts of data, including by help of algorithms, and I hope soon other sorts of artificial intelligence. So I think smaller agencies can do a lot, although we definitely appreciate the international cooperation, and we also operate especially closely with our Nordic neighbors. But now, as a moderator, I want to move to the next topic, which is the question whether the regulatory framework is suitable for reviewing digital mergers. And when it comes to the regulatory framework, it's quite substantial, and we also have very useful guidelines, but the challenges that we face in digital markets have triggered some debates about shortcomings nonetheless. And one of the debates referred to how we consider the burden of proof in digital mergers. So traditionally, competition control looks at the balance of probabilities, essentially asking, is it more likely than not that this merger will harm competition? But given the potentially severe and irreversible consequences in digital markets, there is a growing sentiment that regulators should also consider the balance of harm. And that means assessing not just the likelihood of anti-competitive outcomes, but also the severity of potential harm if those outcomes do materialize. So the idea is that the risk of a very big problem might justify intervention, even if the probability of the problem occurring is low. That, of course, has a trade-off in the sense that it could lead us, if we reduce the threshold for intervention, it could lead us in the direction of too much scrutiny and over-regulation. We could stop too many mergers, which could harm innovation and valuable services for consumers. So I just want to point also at another discussion when it comes to regulatory shortcomings, which relates to the market investigation tool, which you have in the United Kingdom. This is seriously considered in several countries these days, including in Norway. And by market investigation tool, I'm referring to the option of imposing structural and behavioral remedies upon proper analysis of a problem that has evolved or is expected to evolve in a market. Obviously, traditional merger control is the first line of defense in these cases. But the reason why we discuss these challenges is exactly the worry that we will fail to block harmful mergers. This is why it might be useful to have a tool that makes us able to fix the problem if it has materialized, and so that agencies can be able to re-establish competition in a market. So, but Sarah, you have market investigation, but nonetheless, you have updated your merger guidelines to respond to the sort of challenges that we discussed. And this is especially because of digital mergers. Will you explain how you do this and what the result is?
Yeah, thanks so much, Tina. And very briefly on your point about market investigations. So I think you're absolutely right. It's really important to look at the kind of the overall toolkit. But I also think that you're absolutely right that it's far better to stop an anti-competitive merger in the first place than to allow it to go ahead and then have to remedy it later on. So I think when you're looking at merger control in particular, I think there's widespread consensus that historically, particularly around digital mergers, there has been under enforcement. And certainly in the UK, with the CMA, we carried out a review leading to an updated version of our merger assessment guidelines back in 2021. And many of the themes in those updated guidelines really reflect actually many of the themes that Lena mentioned in her keynote just a little bit earlier. It's very much about making sure that the analytical framework that we use really reflects the commercial and the economic reality of these digital markets and the way that competition concerns can arise. So a good example of that is as Lena was saying, sort of thinking about future competition and dynamic competition. So we have a structure which looks not only at the potential for future entry and therefore the possibility that a merger might remove that prospect of future entry as a concern in and of itself, but also importantly, and this is, I think, a particular feature of digital mergers, digital markets, although it's not unique, I think it arises in some other areas where you see a lot of innovation as well, is that you could have a potential entrant who is innovating and developing ideas, and you may well have an incumbent who is aware of that innovation. And the fact that they are innovating, even if they haven't yet entered, or the prospect of that entry, is generating a competitive constraint now. It's already affecting the way the incumbent is behaving. And that is something that we wanted to make crystal clear in our guidance is a real concern, and where you don't need to have absolute certainty that that player will come into the market in the future, because the prospect of entry in and of itself is creating a competitive constraint. So that's something that we put out very clearly in the revised guidance back in 2021. Again, it was a feature of our analysis in the Meta-Giphy merger, which was upheld by our court in the UK. And I think that's really important when you look at these kind of deals. The other thing that we picked up and focused on in our guidelines is the role of uncertainty, which goes a little bit to your question around the burden of proof, because there was some discussion in the UK about should we move away from balance of probabilities and move to a balance of harms. And I think overall the consensus view was that that would not be appropriate or necessary. But what we did make very clear in our revised guidelines was that particularly in these markets which are fast moving and when you can't predict with any absolute certainty how the markets will develop, it's absolutely critical to make sure that that uncertainty in and of itself doesn't chill effective merger control. So we need to take that uncertainty as a given. We need to carry out our assessment knowing that we can't know everything, but on the basis of what we know, what do we think the most likely competition outcome might be, and assess the merger on that basis. And I think you do see a shift there, making sure that we take account of all the evidence that we have available to us, but recognizing that we can't operate in a world of perfect information. But I think, again, Alexandra, I think you've been looking in Brazil at perhaps something a little bit similar to the DMA in the EU, but more generally, what's your view of the sort of Brazilian landscape in terms of whether you have the right sort of toolkit to be tackling issues in digital markets?
Thank you, Sarah. From our perspective, digital markets and their implications are not an entirely new subject, at least from an economic perspective. So the economic phenomena such as multi-sided market, mavericks, network effects, low marginal cost, disruptive innovation, winners takes all or winners take most, among others, are some of the well-known features that may influence the assessment of the effects of antitrust practices and market concentration. However, over the past years, competition authorities and scholars around the world have been debating alternatives to foster competition in the digital economy and avoid the exercise of market power by digital platforms. So it was raised the questions of whether competition law around the world are prepared to deal with effects of economic power in these new markets. So of course, the speed and the constant changes of these elements in digital markets may require analytical adjustments, in particular when assessing the degree of market power which can present the range of challenge for competition authorities. So in my opinion, our current competition law and regulation can be easily adjusted to deal with these important changes in digital market. Although the core economic foundation of market power assessment have also remained consistent in digital cases, namely the focus on barrier of entry and substitutability as range of a concept have been introduced to capture particular forms of alternative concept to market power, specifically the power held in digital platforms to intermediate between firms and consumers, such gatekeepers, bottleneck power, platforms power, intermediation power, and strategic market status, among others. So there is, in Brazil, a bill right now in Congress talking about this discussion and to regulate the digital market. And it's a kind of the Brazilian GMA. It's inspired in Europe, but the discussion is still very at the beginning. And CADE, because of its experience in assessment of mergers, control, and conduct case in digital market, we're starting getting this discussion, and there's always the big discussion about the limit of the regulation. So how deep we're going to go forward in this regulation and the paradox about innovation. So there is the discussion. It's huge in Brazil right now, but it's still in the beginning.
Thank you.
So let me give the floor to
Thank
Tina
you.
again.
And we are now moving to the next topic, and how to pursue ecosystem theories of harm, and whether conglomerate theories of harm are enforced in digital markets. And I'm returning to you, Alexandre, because at KG, you recently reviewed a number of mergers that addressed issues in digital and connected markets. For instance, you at KG was one of the first jurisdictions to clear the Microsoft Activision transaction. How do you see KG's experience in reviewing mergers in digital markets?
Thank you, Tina. So KG has recently issued a working document on conglomerate mergers and theory of harm based on their cases law, spanning from 2012 and 2022. It was 10 years of experience in those type of cases. These documents shed light on the intricate world of conglomerate mergers, especially in the ever-evolving landscape of digital markets. So competition authorities worldwide generally understand that conglomerate mergers are typically pro-competitive. In fact, as recognized in the European Commission guidelines on non-horizontal mergers, conglomerate mergers are generally considered to have a pro-competitive effect. So there are at least 4 traditional theories developed to identify potential harm arising from conglomerate effect, which have been called upon to address concerns regarding conglomerate effects. For example, cross-merger effects, and entrenchment of economic power, substantial lessening of competition, and increased aggregate concentration. So, and you're right, we analyzed the Microsoft and Activision case, and this, we cleared this case in 2022, and it's very worth it and mentioning that issue of cloud in-game market was kind of a problem in Brazil. And the market tests carried out in Brazil indicate that despite being a trend, it is still nationally incipient. And there would be no need to create a separate relevant market for subscription service. Therefore, they were considered within a digital distribution market, and in other jurisdictions, this market has been indicated as a crucial to operation decision. In this case, the big thing was, and the discussion was, the game of Call of Duty. And in Brazil, this wasn't a big deal. It's not so popular, and we have other games, and that could be easily substitutable. That was the case in Brazil, was very fast released. So let me go to Olivier and give the floor to Olivier, and I have a question for him. And Olivier, what is the Commission's experience with pursuing ecosystem theory of harm to date?
Well, thanks, Alex. It's a long time now that we're busy with ecosystems, but for a long time it was mainly in antitrust. I mean, if you think about it, Microsoft 25 years ago was an ecosystem case. And this type of cases, we had a number throughout the years, and they became more and more complex, more and more multi-sided. And if you think about Google Android, in a way that's so far the biggest and most complex ecosystem case in an abuse of dominant position context. We've also been very clear throughout that, of course, there is a connection. I mean, what you look like when you review a measure is try to prevent a situation in which there would be the possibility to abuse the dominant position later. So it is obvious that there is a connection between the two. And there as well, we've been busy with that topic for a number of years. And if you remember back in 2018, the famous Wise Men report on competition policy in the digital era contained very interesting considerations on ecosystem theories and how to deal with it. And we have had a string of cases so far. Of course, MS Activision, you just mentioned, but a number of cases in which actually we intervened, some of which for which we were the only ones to intervene, like Google Fitbit, but also like Meta Customer. The Commissioner mentioned this morning Amazon MGM as well. All these are ecosystem cases. But I think the interesting point is not so much ecosystem, it's within ecosystems entrenchment, because this is what is really new, and this is where there is a nut to crack. We have one case of entrenchment, very recent, as you know, Booking. And in this case, really, the question is, how do you move away from the traditional framework for analysis, the one that is in our guidelines? You know, this ability incentives effect assessment in cases of various types of foreclosures, which is normally what you would expect to find, and what actually in the vast majority of cases you are and still will be confronted with. In Booking, the question was a bit different, really, and it was how to capture the fact that through a variety of relationships, the acquisition would strengthen the barriers that protect the core market, the one from which the power is leveraged, and in that case, the market for the platform OTA for hotels, and therefore strengthen the dominant position. We have had long internal discussions, caricature of which I can read in the specialist press sometimes, and I emphasize caricatures, because it's new, and I think we have not finished to discuss this. But I don't think competition authorities can afford not to deal with this. And actually, we have had also questions, as you know, when we take a decision with the help of our fellows in the ICN. So we have had an advisory committee, and I have to say that this is a shared concerns among competition authorities in Europe that this issue needs to be tackled. To take the specificity of this case, I will simply take one example to show that it is exotic, and yet it is not as exotic as you may think. It is a non-horizontal merger, obviously, and by the own admission of the internal documents of the parties, it would have resulted into a sizable increase in the market share on their core market. I think this alone may make you think about whether it is not something that is worth tackling. And maybe last but not least, but I will come back to this later, it was also a case for which there was no remedy, or at least no remedy that a decent competition authority would have accepted. So on this, Michael, I think it's over to you for the last theme.
Remedies, yes. Well, as the digital landscape evolves, clearly we need to understand the most effective ways of dealing with remedies when digital mergers raise competition concerns, and to use another Catalan proverb, to avoid what they say in Catalan, es pitjor el remei que la malaltia, or in Castellano, el remedio es peor que la enfermedad, the remedy is worse than the illness. The unique characteristics of the digital market sector, rapid innovation, network effects, digital ecosystems, mean that classical structural remedies, such as divestiture, are often not appropriate, except perhaps to deal with horizontal unilateral effects. Behavioral commitments, on the other hand, have certain advantages. They are more flexible, to be tailored to adapt to this fast-moving market. They can be implemented more swiftly, as opposed to lengthy divestiture processes. But they also have limitations. They rely on effective monitoring. Means regulators must have the resources and expertise to ensure compliance and the ability to predict and address harm to competition. And they can be particularly difficult, I think, to implement in the context of digital ecosystems. But agencies have been prepared increasingly to adopt behavioral equipment, access, interoperability commitments. And I think there is a need for imaginative and sophisticated remedies in this sector when the alternative is simply prohibition and the loss of all the benefits of the merger. So, Olivier, the Commission has accepted non-divestiture remedies for digital transactions, particularly in the recent Microsoft Activision case. Can these types of remedies continue to present valid solutions?
Well, I mean, I've said it everywhere, I will say it one more time. I think like most enforcers in the world, if not all, we prefer structural, we prefer divestiture, because it provides for a permanent structural fix to a permanent structural issue. That, I think, is no secret. Now, it's connected to the previous debates. I mean, these non-horizontal mergers that are, in a way, so specific of digital ecosystems and create specific issues, they usually, or very often, cannot be solved through a divestiture. Or the only divestiture available is not to merge, which is akin to a prohibition. So the question is, should they be automatically prohibited or not? Then I assume that depends on the legal system you operate in. In Europe, we're in a legal system in which we have to motivate all our decisions, and we have a duty, if we reject a remedy, to explain why, and the why cannot simply be it's inconvenient to monitor. So another way to say this is that where divestiture is not available, in particular in digital mergers, but you have a remedy that fixes the problem in at least equivalent way to a structural solution. What I mean by this is it fixes the problem and the market agrees with it, so the market test comes back positive. It is easy to implement and monitor. It's not clouded by huge asymmetries of information etc. And it is in line with market realities. In this case, if it fits these characteristics, we would normally clear the merger subject to the remedy. Because we believe that if we would prohibit, when faced with such a remedy with a positive market test, we would not stand a chance in court. But maybe in other legal systems it's different, and that may explain sometimes different outcomes, of course. So, but at least this is the way it is in Europe. So when a remedy meets this criteria and is positively received by the market, well, we would tend to clear. This is what we did in Google Fitbit with a data silo. This is what we did in Microsoft Activision, 10 years licensing remedy free for all in the EA. This is what we did in Meta Customer, actually with the 10 years API access commitment. Now, of course, conversely, when this standard for remedies cannot be met, which was very much the case in our view in Booking. In Booking, we think the remedy was too complex, too behavioral, too difficult to monitor, and too clouded by asymmetries of information. So in other words, it had every chances to be ineffective, and probably for that reason, it didn't receive a positive market test. Well, in that case, we have no other choice but to prohibit. So in a way, this is a complex issue, but I hope this is a simple answer. At least this is the way we see it. But Sarah, maybe you want to complement. You have some experience as well in this domain.
Thanks, Olivier. So look, again, I don't think there's any fundamental difference there. I think in the UK, very similarly, for us, it's really about making sure that the remedy comprehensively addresses any concern and that it's effective, and that's the legal test. And I think it's important, and certainly the approach that we take, is that the risk really is on the merging parties to make sure that they can fully and comprehensively address our concerns. It's not, I think, for the competition agency to take the risk on an ineffective remedy, because ultimately the people who suffer from that at the end of the day are the consumers or the businesses who will be adversely affected by that. So in relation to digital mergers, it's very much the same for us as it is in any mergers. It's about looking at the specifics of the case. It's about making sure that any remedy that is put forward fully and comprehensively addresses our concerns, is effective, and if that's not the case, then applying our legal standard, we have no choice but to prohibit the deal. That is our responsibility under UK law, and that's the way that the system works. I think there's a lot of debate about behavioural, structural. I think, again, very similarly to, as Olivier has said, there's sort of clear, and we've certainly done a lot of ex post analysis in the UK about the concerns around behavioural remedies, both in terms of effectiveness and also in terms of sort of monitoring. It doesn't mean that they are impossible, and it certainly doesn't mean that we sort of reject them out of hand, but it does mean, I think quite rightly, that there is a high bar to them. So, I mean, obviously in the Microsoft case, we decided not to accept the remedy that was put forward to us, applying the legal framework that we had, and ultimately where we ended up was something that was more of a sort of restructured transaction, quite a fundamentally restructured transaction from our perspective, that addressed the competition concerns that we had identified fully and effectively. But I don't think the approach sort of philosophically is any different. Alexandra, I know again in Brazil, I seem to be turning to you each time at the moment. I think you've done a lot of work on merger remedies, produced some guidance, I think back in 2018, and some further thinking in 2020, but perhaps you could share a little bit of that with us.
Thank you, Sarah. So as you know, it mentioned, CAD has published two important studies on remedies. The Guide on Antitrust Remedy that was published in 2018, and the working document Antitrust Remedy at CAD, that is an overview of formal decision that was published in 2020, which addresses merger cleared subject to remedies from 2014 and 2019. So it was 5 years of experience. We hold that all antitrust remedies imposed must meet the criteria of being proportional, timely, feasible, and very verifiable. So most importantly, we must assess whether the remedy effectively addressed the competition concern at hand. Also, we must strive for alignment with the remedy applied in other jurisdictions, and this remains our big concern and priority. Having said, designing effective remedy in that context of digital markets present a unique challenge and an opportunity, and the traditional classification of structural and non-structural remedies as outlined at the ICN Merger Remedies Guide in 2016 remain relevant, but adapting them to the digital market reality requires a very nuanced approach. So choosing the right remedy is an exercise, and it's not something easy to reach the exact point to intervene, and there is a lot of costs of that. Cost of errors type 1 and errors type 2, and the problem is always choose which side you're going to be. To intervene most or less can cause one type of error or the other type of error. For our experience in Brazil, we are always looking, when we're talking about digital market, to design not just one scenario, but more scenarios, so we can adopt those decisions and those remedies that's more conservative. Usually, it's what we do. So, let me give the floor to Tina again.
Thank you. And unfortunately, I see we are, I'm looking at the watch, and it's time to conclude this plenary session. We wanted to continue the discussion and go into the way we cooperate internationally. We don't really have time for it, but it's at least still extremely clear to all of us that we have to work together to secure competition in digital markets, and there's a clear role both for large and small agencies in that respect. On behalf of the panel, I want to thank all those who contributed to the Merger Group's Digital Mergers project and all its activities. I want to thank our colleagues at DG COM for helping us to prepare this plenary session. Thank you, Spain, for organizing this wonderful conference. And thank you all for listening.
Well done.
Thank you very much. Now we have the lunch break. We will see you back in the breakout sessions at 2. Thank you.